I'm a professor of psychology. I'm at a small liberal arts college in East Tennessee, so it's very religiously conservative here. So I feel very blessed that I have this job where I can teach psychology, and as part of teaching psychology, I also teach human sexuality and intimate relationships and a women's sexual health class for freshmen. So yeah, I really enjoy what I do.
Incredible. So you said that it is a private school. Is that right?
Mhm. Yes, it's affiliated with Presbyterian, um, but it's not a Presbyterian school.
What is that like teaching human sexuality at a university where there are these religious ties?
It is amazing on a lot of levels. And luckily, I have a very supportive dean and a supportive chair. And so I feel um, intellectually supported that they agree that, I can do this work. But I will say it's very rewarding in that I have students who have come through the public school system in Tennessee and the surrounding areas. And in our area in the South, they don't teach comprehensive sex ed, they teach abstinence only. So that means that all they can talk about is how to not have sex. And so we do know that by the time kids graduate high school, at least half of them have had sex. So they're not learning how to do it in a safer way. And they're not learning about their bodies. They're not learning, what's harmful and what's helpful. And so they come to me. They've got a lot of bad information and no information. And as soon as I start teaching them just basics about, anatomy, just about their bodies, you can see this anger well up in them, and they become upset that nobody has taught them this before. And then all of a sudden they become this sex education activist, and they're like, everybody should have this information. I'm like, yes, yes, they should. It would be awesome. So to be able to have that job where I teach people who then are excited to learn this information, it's the best. It's the
That's
best.
incredible. That's incredible. I'm curious if anything comes to mind, maybe not, but are there any specific things that you've noticed that when you teach this to someone, it kind of triggers that upset? Like, why didn't I know this? Are there any recurrent things you've noticed really does it for people?
Yeah, so I'm currently teaching a women's sexual health is for freshman women. And one of the things that I teach is about female anatomy, and I teach about the clitoris. And I also show them pictures of what they have probably seen in high school. And they're like, yeah, we've seen that. I'm like, well, that's wrong. For one, the clitoris isn't there. And here it is. And so I show them pictures. And when I tell them that it has 10,000 nerve endings and that its sole purpose is for pleasure, and then I link it to, many of my students grow up very religiously. And so they believe in God. I then say, if you believe in a higher being that created humans, that means that that being created a clitoris for women that does nothing but pleasure. God created the clitoris. That means he wants women to have pleasure. And he put 10,000 nerve endings there. And so he wants you to have a lot of pleasure. And there's power in that. And you can see it clicking. And when they get it, they're like, oh. And so, yeah, I teach about that, and I draw on the work of Betty Dotson. And Betty Dotson was all about women. There's no way that women can rule the world if they can't control their own orgasm. So they need to understand their own body and know how it works. And I believe that as well. That and if you believe in a higher being, I would think they would want us to know about the creation that is us. So yeah, I like that part. And that is one particular part where they get it and then they're like, why didn't I know that?
How you just worded that, even for me, hearing that just now, it was emotional. Seriously, I almost had tears in my eyes when you were like, because as you mentioned, you do teach at a private university with religious ties. So many of your students and faculty are probably going to have beliefs in a higher being, God, that created them. And so your wording of, if you believe in God that created you, then you have to believe that God also created this organ whose sole purpose is just pleasure, and pleasure for women.
Yes, that's it. That's it.
And that is so powerful, because I don't think it's a secret that women's pleasure in particular, I think in general, most cultures have an issue with anyone experiencing too much pleasure, but especially women experiencing too much pleasure seems to be extremely taboo, and it makes people quite uncomfortable.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And it's not just men doing that to women. Women do that to ourselves too, right? We feel guilty if we have too much pleasure. And we've been trained that it's fine for men to have pleasure, but women, so yeah, there's a lot of that as well in the society.
Where do you think that really originates from?
So I've been trying to research some of this, and what I hear people saying, and what is believed to be true is a very puritanical approach in the creation of the U.S. With European influences, and through colonization of the United States, and with the influx of religious beliefs, and then of course with many revivals throughout the South, and the focus on religion. A lot of that has come down through a Christianity puritanical perspective, and that sex outside of marriage is wrong, and that marriage is between a man and a woman. That view is very much has its roots in Christian evangelical approach.
I'm curious, what led you to this profession? What drew you down this path?
So, being a psychology professor sort of came about in a couple of different ways, but the way I came to the sexuality portion of it was when I was hired here. I'm a developmental psychologist, and that's what I was trained in. That's what my PhD is in. But the parts of that was always fascinating to me was relationships, and love and relationships and attraction. So when I got here, my chair needed to have a particular course filled, and it was topical and interdisciplinary. And she said, your job talk had a lot about relationships in it. Would you like to teach a course on intimate relationships? And I'm like, yeah, yes, please. So I created a course, and 1 week of it was sexuality. And go figure, but that's the topic that the college students really seemed drawn to. And they hadn't had any information or any place where they could speak openly with their thoughts. So I decided that if I'm going to teach that course, I need to get some more background in sexuality, because up until that point, I had never had a class on sexuality, even though in psychology and developmental psychology, never once. And in fact, there would be a sexuality chapter in the textbooks that we would have classes on, and the professors would always skip over that chapter.
Oh.
Every time, because everybody was afraid to talk about it. So I find that fascinating in and of itself. But then I'm like, okay, so I've got to find the people that do this work. And I found various organizations. So QuadS is the Society for the Scientific Study of Sexuality. And I joined them, and I started going to their conferences and presenting research there. And you find out all the cutting edge research. So that has helped in my own self-education. Then I also joined ASECT, and I became ASECT certified sex educator, and that's the American Association of Sexuality Educators, Counselors, and Therapists. And then I've joined other organizations as well and gained more certifications. And so now I now I feel like I have some education under my belt, and I, the thing about teaching sexuality that's different than any other topic is because the topic is so taboo, you have to be trained in how to teach a taboo topic. So you have to go in a way that you're not upsetting people who are liberal activists, sexuality professionals in their own right, along with evangelicals who have been taught that sex is bad their whole life. So you have to create a space where both of those can live in the space and speak and not be afraid to say what they think and make it okay. That took some work.
Oh, yes. I can only imagine because it's such a fine dance.
Yeah, and there's moments, of course, when I'm human and I don't get it right. And then there's other moments. I had this one class where I was teaching about intersexuality. So it's people who have both female and male reproductive organs. And so I was teaching about this, and there was a very conservative man in the room, and he kept pointing at it. He was like, "Is that a dude? Is that a dude?" Because this person had breasts and was very attractive. And so he was trying to reconcile in his own mind, I feel attracted to that person, but if that person's a dude, then that means I'm gay. So how do I deal with this? And so I need you to fix this for me, because his mind was exploding. And so when I finally, tried to work him through what was going on, and it was important to do that because I knew there was more people in there feeling the same struggle. I worked him through it. He then said, well, in Christianity, we don't, and he started down. And so then I had somebody across the room who was questioning their own gender identity and very much an activist in the LGBTQ community on campus, jumped up out of their seat and was like, "You can't claim Christianity. You can't." And I was like, "No, no." And I had, even though I was sympathetic and felt the same thing that person was feeling, I had to make it okay for him to speak. Because if I shut him down, that means I lose half the class. So I was like, "Nope, nope, I got you. Please just sit down, let him speak." And so he got out everything he was saying. And then I turned to the other person and let them speak. After it was over, one person wrote a letter to the other person, had me read it in class, and they hugged and became friends. It was like, if every class could be that way, that's the way that would fix the world.
Wow.
And so it's because sexuality is so raw and so much of our core that we come at it with such vigor.
What's so interesting slash beautiful about what you just shared was simply allowing someone the space to speak and share without judgment, without
That's the
being
key.
attacked. Yes, that created healing for everyone, it sounds like.
Yes. Yes, it did. And that's the key. It's the judgment. Because we've all been shamed in one way or another, especially about sex. And so they come to class almost ready to get shamed again. And I'm like, "No, no, no, we're not doing that here." And so I tell them at the very beginning, I was like, "I don't condone any sexual behavior. I don't condemn any sexual behavior. I am presenting information, and we're coming at this from all our different perspectives. And then you take what you need to take from it, and you make your decisions." And I said, if you want to remain a virgin until you get married, I'm going to help you do that and give you the information so that you are ready to go when you choose. If you want to have sex with 3 people this weekend, I'm going to give you the information so that you can do that as safely as you possibly can. So yeah, I'm like, no judgment. Nobody should be judged for their history, their experiences, their thoughts. Let's get them out and play with them, see where it goes.
You know, it's really interesting you say that. And also, we touched on it a little bit earlier. that there's not a lot of places that people have where they can just go and talk about sex or share their, like you said, kind of just get it out and see where it goes, see what's going on. We're from LiveJasmin, and a lot of members are on the site because it is a place where they're allowed to just go and talk about sex. And there aren't many places. And it's interesting because, and I tell everyone this, and I say it a lot, but it's something that really stands out to me and I find interesting. When I interview members and I ask them, do you have a favorite model? Most of them are like, yeah, I've been talking to the same model for 15 years, 10 years. If they're newer to the site, whatever the length of time they've been on the site, more times than not, they have a model that they've been talking to for that whole time or, years. And what I think it is, when I'm like, okay, what creates this 15-year bond with someone you've never met? You can only talk to them through, technology. And mind you, 15 years ago, technology was not as connective as it is now. It was like typing and that's it. There was no video, there was no video calls and all that. So what I think it is that when you find someone who you can share about these vulnerable parts of yourself and not be judged, but instead you feel accepted by them and it becomes so safe, I think it bonds people. Like now that I see that, I'm like, okay, I think people are feeling so bonded to the space where they felt safe and unjudged when they must feel judged in that space from the rest of the world, even some of their partners.
I think you are 100% right. I think that's exactly it. I think that there's so much shame, especially around sex. And then you internalize that and have that guilt feeling. And being in a place where it's freeing. And I even get that on my student comments, my evaluations at the end, is that this was one of the first places or the only place where they could say whatever they needed to say and not feel judged by somebody else. And that's a value that, I mean, to me, that's the only way learning can take place, or that's the only way healing can take place. And yeah, I think you nailed it. That's exactly it. That freedom and connection and support. It's vital.
You just used a really powerful word, connection. From your research, what you've seen, what role does connection play in our sexualities?
So I think I have to answer this by even taking one step a little bit bigger, in that connection is so important. So if you look at it evolutionary perspective, we're pack animals. We aren't meant to be a sole hunter. We need each other in order to survive. So that's the way we're wired. Also, if you look at psychological research, looking at skin to skin contact from birth, we need that so badly, and that connection is important. And then all throughout attachment research, we need to be connected to each other. So I think you're exactly right about connection, in that its role just in our lives as human beings and in our well-being. We need each other. I think we also learned a lot of things through COVID, when everything kind of went online and we lost a lot of the in-person contact. And we learned that it is a good way to connect with each other. I mean, I made friends with people all around the country and the globe just by having Zoom meetings with people and other sex educators. And it was beautiful. And had COVID not happened, I mean, I'm not suggesting COVID was good in any way, but during the pandemic, it did allow for us to think outside the box. And I think it opened up a lot of things for us. Now, I will say, by the end of 2 years, being isolated and only having that contact was a bit much. And it was very, I think collectively, we needed to be back in person. So I think there is utility and effectiveness in both, that if we had not had that, I would have never connected with these beautiful people all around the world, and I would have missed out. However, we also need the in-person. And if you were single during that time, I know there was a lot of mental health problems, people being in lockdown by themselves. That was not mentally healthy. Having a romantic partner was very helpful during that time, as long as you got along. It could have gone the other way. But so, yeah, I would agree that connection is key for in person, but the online has its own special place, and is a good one.
I mean, absolutely. It's, someone was saying, because obviously during that time of isolation, sites like LiveJasmin saw an increase in usage because people were home alone and they needed intimacy or just straight up connection. I've interviewed members who have never even seen a model without her clothes on, but they love talking to these models. I mean, of course you're going to love talking to a beautiful woman. And then again, like you mentioned, that aspect of being from all these different parts of the world and kind of figuring out, how is it where you are? What's going on in lockdown there? This is what's happening here, or just learning about the culture as a whole is another really interesting aspect that technology is bringing us, in that we're able to connect from anywhere. And the pandemic did change a lot, in the sense that even how we do interviews, like this interaction now, is kind of a byproduct of the pandemic, where we realized, what, we don't have to do everything in person, actually. No, actually, just jumping on a Zoom call and recording that is well enough, and it gives so much more opportunity to have a lot more, at least for a project like this, many different perspectives from all over the country and all over the world. And I think it makes for a more whole picture when you get multiple perspectives based off of other people's experience and culture and whatever the case is. So I completely agree. The pandemic did shift things for us in some ways that I think brought about a lot of opportunity and positive things. So
Absolutely.
you mentioned that you kind of jumped on board with an organization that shares a lot of the latest research when you yourself were wanting to learn more. During that time, was there ever a piece of research, or since you've kind of really been studying sexuality and learning how to teach it, has there been a piece of research that you've seen that just jumped out at you as so interesting and fascinating? Sure, lots, but
All of it. Oh, that's a big question.
if
Well,
anything comes to mind, yeah.
so one that I already mentioned is the 10,000 nerve endings in the clitoris. That one was big, of course. Oh, let me think. So much. So I will tell you just a little bit about some of the research that I've done, which of course I find interesting, or else I wouldn't do it.
Yeah.
But oh, and I will also mention I have a colleague who did research on the 1 in 5 statistic, that 1 in 5 women are sexually assaulted by the time they're 25. And that statistic holds up over multiple studies. It wasn't just one that she went back and kind of did a mini meta-analysis to see. And it's just shameful that we allow this to continue in our society. But some of the research that I do as well, as shameful plug, is I look at how sex education and religion affects your sex guilt and feelings of shame once you've had sex. And then what does that shame and guilt lead to? And so what we find is that, yes, religious and particularly evangelical belief system and a abstinence-only sex education lead to more guilt once you have sex. We also find that that group has sex at the same rate as other people, so it doesn't even extend when you start having sex. So yeah, these kids around here are having sex at about the same time as everybody else in the country. So it's not working if they're trying to stop people from having sex. It doesn't work. But then what happens is your sexual satisfaction is lower as a result of that guilt. And your sexual self-efficacy is lower and your sex anxiety is higher. So you're having bad sex, you're feeling anxious about it, and you don't think you can do anything to fix it. That is not a setup to have then a healthy relationship with somebody. So that is some of the research that I do, and in this area. The other research that we've done is comparing evangelicals in Tennessee to Latter-day Saints in Utah and Catholics in a Catholic school in Texas. And we find that guilt is felt similarly, although it tends to be higher among evangelicals. And also that part of that, we think, is that it's due to there's no release of that guilt. So in Catholicism, you can go to a priest, you confess, you get absolution. In Latter-day Saints and Mormon belief, there's a 4-step process that you can go through and receive forgiveness. In evangelical perspective, you pray and you give it to God, and if you still feel guilty, that's your fault. And so then you feel guilty that you're not good enough to release the guilt, and you still feel guilty.
That is so fascinating to me. I cannot even tell you. That's really interesting. Congratulations and bravo on the work you're doing. Because, no, really, I think the work you're doing is actually extremely important and impactful. You're doing this important research, which I know that there's not enough research in. I always joke, it could be true. I don't know if it's true, but I always joke and say, I think we know more about the moon than human sexuality at this point, because we just don't have as much funding or support for the research. But I really found that research interesting, that even within this religious context, people that are associated with certain religions that have a practice for relieving guilt or relieving whatever they're feeling, shame, are better off to a degree because they're able to get rid of some of that guilt. It may come back, but then they can get rid of it again. But the people who don't have a practice for relieving guilt are just kind of stuck.
Yes. Yes. Yes, you're exactly right. It is detrimental because then you just perseverate on it and it eats into your mental health. And again, it doesn't set you up for a healthy relationship with another person when you're feeling that and you can't release. Yeah. And I think also there is this idea that shame regarding sexuality is a good thing because it stops people from behaving in particular ways. And the problem is, what I'm finding is that's not true. It doesn't stop anybody. What it does is it stops them from talking to those people and they find another group that they can share with. And so this is particularly for parents and kids. I was just having a conversation with some others and other researchers who are looking into how do you talk to your kids about sex and how do you raise them to be healthy sexual beings. And the key there, this was by Deborah Rothman. She said, when kids ask questions about sex, they're asking questions about science. Like they want to know how things work.
Right.
But in our minds, because we're programmed that there's shame around sex, we think they're asking dirty questions. And so we shut it down. And so what the kid has now learned is don't talk to sex. Don't talk about sex with mom.
Mm-hmm.
So then they start asking somewhere else and they go look online and, they're going to find out answers. They're just not doing it with that person. So that's, another reason why I think shame is so detrimental is it shuts down healthy progress.
And it's so embedded in how we deal with all things related to sex. I mean, especially when it comes to adolescence and youth, and in some ways, okay, rightfully so, right? But in other ways, it's detrimental. I interviewed a woman who told me, she was raised in one of these kind of really religious groups. And so she grew up with really kind of negative programming around sex, which is sex is horrible and evil unless you're married one day. Then,
Right.
right? But she actually followed the teachings of that religion to a T, and she didn't have sex until she was married. But the sex is horrible and evil part was still in her mind. And so she said that she actually suffered. Even within the dynamic of the marriage, it took her a long time to be comfortable with sex at all.
Yes, that is a brilliant observation. And that it's called a classical conditioning response. You pair two things together over and over. So you may be familiar with Pavlov's dogs, right? So he would pair meat and the dogs would salivate, right? And then you pair a bell with it. And over time, dogs will salivate to a bell. So, you open a chip bag and they think it's their treats and they start salivating.
Mm-hmm.
You pair negativity with sex or shame with sex over and over and over and over, then just because you get married and God says it's okay, it doesn't relieve that classical conditioning you've had your whole life. And so then you still feel the guilt and shame, and then it makes your sex life and your connection with your partner not as great. And then you feel like it's your fault because you can't let go of it. And so then you get shamed again for not being able to let go. And yeah, it's a bad setup. Bad setup. It's a bad way to educate kids. And I know that it's because people care about kids and they don't want kids to get hurt through sex. I know that. But it's not working and it's causing harm.
I've seen some of the studies that have actual data that shows that kids and adolescents who had a lot more honest sexual education had fewer teen pregnancies, fewer STIs. In fact, they were engaging in sex less than kids that had abstinence only, which shows exactly, if you stop treating it like a taboo, there's less of this like, oh, I need to explore this on my own, like, and rebelling against that or whatever whatever the case is. I'm sure there's infinite number of things. But yeah, when you are honest about sex and you give people the information, then it seems like the data shows that they're actually making better choices around sex, safer choices around sex.
Yes, you're exactly right. I take a group of students every few years over to the net. Well, I've done it once so far, and I've been myself with another group to the Netherlands. The Netherlands has comprehensive sex education. They start at age 4, and they start teaching about consent, and they start teaching, and it's not about sexuality at that point. It's about connections and relationships. Like somebody doesn't want to play a game, you don't make them keep playing the game. They can go do something else. And so you learn that, this is your body and you get to say no if you don't want to be hugged. And so they learn those kinds of things and they learn about healthy relationships. When they get to be teens, we see the Netherlands has the lowest rates of STIs in the world. They're among the lowest in abortion. And it's not because they don't have abortions there. In fact, their abortions are completely covered by the government, completely paid for, completely free. But they have the fewest. They're the 4th in the world on abortions because they have learned about healthy sex. They've learned how to prevent pregnancy. they also are starting to have sex at a later time. So it's about 6 months to a year different than in the US. And it's because they're waiting because they want their first sex to be the best sex. And that's completely separate from what I hear from my students here, is that when they first have sex, they're just trying to get it over with. And women are often taught that it hurts for women the first time. So just grin and bear it, get through it, and then you can start having fun.
What a lie. We are here to tell you that's a lie. It's a lie.
Total lie.
Total
Total
lie. You know, everyone's experience is unique. That is not the general rule. And yeah, really interesting. I I'm still almost stuck on this idea that is so true, but the way you presented it, again, it's so powerful. I've never heard anyone say it that way. And the fact that if you believe in a creator, this creator made women with an organ that is just about pleasure. It has 10,000 nerve endings. All it does is to give a woman pleasure. Or correct me if I'm wrong. Does it do anything else?
That's what it does. That's it. The phrase I like to use is God created the clitoris.
Is there anything on a man's body with that many nerve endings?
No. So the penis does not have that many nerve endings. It's about half of that from the latest research that I can find. And the kind of the analogy that I make in class is, so the functions of the penis are urination, reproduction, and pleasure. And then I say, okay, women, what are the functions of the clitoris? Let's name them. And they're like, pleasure? I'm like, yes, that's all it does. The penis is kind of like a Swiss Army knife, that it does all these things. And the clitoris is this highly specialized, unique piece of, it's like a Lamborghini. Like it does this one thing really, really well. And it's really special. And women should, I mean, we should feel so incredibly blessed to have this highly specialized organ that does this one thing and this one thing only. And I mean, that's kind of powerful.
So
And we should know how to drive it.
yes, 100%. And I think, and see, this is why as you're talking, I'm just thinking like, we've been robbed, ladies. Like we have been robbed of this knowledge because exactly, even how you're putting it, like I can see why when you're teaching, students are like, what? And you see them get angrier. Honestly, I told you myself, I initially almost was moved to tears in how you said that because you're right. Many women don't know how to drive the clitoris. They don't realize that they literally have an organ for pleasure alone. Men don't have that. And nature is very intentional. So if nature or God, whatever you want to believe in or you do believe in, whether it's God or evolution, there's a reason.
That's right.
It's very intentional. It's there. Men don't have it. We do. We're not taught to capitalize on it. In fact, we're taught to indulge too much in pleasure is very bad for a woman, very wrong.
Right. And it's dirty. I mean, we don't even give it a proper name. It's down there. And women are taught that part of their body is not to be looked at, not it's not beautiful. It's, all the horrible names that go along with female genitalia. And it is stunning. It's gorgeous. It's powerful. And we have an organ like men don't have.
10,000 nerve endings.
10,000. 10,000.
I recently interviewed someone who mentioned the fact that because women, don't have this knowledge, when they are only having vaginal sex and they're not having an orgasm or it's not very pleasurable, she was saying, well, the nerve endings aren't really in the vagina because the vagina gives birth. You don't want that many nerve endings there. It would
That's
really
right.
Like we're barely handling birth now, but if we had even more nerve endings, it would be unbearable. But there's women who think there's something wrong with them because they're not having an orgasm through this way that they're taught they should, when in fact, that is not, should not be the focus. The actual vagina is not the focus. You're saying the clitoris is.
Exactly, exactly. And the most recent research that I have says that only about 30% of women have ever had an orgasm through vaginal stimulation alone. So it's not even in the norm
Mm-hmm.
to have an orgasm just through penetrative sex. It also needs to include clitoral stimulation or some other stimulation. So yeah, when women hear that, and I can see that in my human sexuality class, is when I say that, you can see women stop. And there's that moment where they're like, so I'm not broken. So I'm okay. And I'm like, yes, yes. In fact, you're normal. And I think that's a lot of why people seek out sexuality information, is because of the lack of it. They think that something's wrong with them, or they're deformed, or they're broken, they don't function right. And in fact, that's likely not true at all. They just need some more education and understanding of their own bodies.
Wow. Really well said. What would you say are some of the main or key aspects of human sexuality that are misunderstood or misrepresented in mainstream discussions? I think we touched on one as far as female pleasure and where it actually comes from.
That's a great question. I would say, um, yeah, anatomy is key, and that's often where I start, because then that levels the playing field and it opens up a lot of conversation. Another key point I think about sexuality is people think that it's so strictly on a dichotomy, and that there is male and there is female. And once you learn about nature, you learn about other species and animals, farm animals, I mean, just all kinds of animals. There is very little in our society that is actually set up on a dichotomy. There is so much overlap between genitalia, but also in how men and women behave. So we tend to think that it's that title, men are from Mars and women are from Venus.
Yeah.
We have that kind of false dichotomy set up in our minds, that men and women are so different from each other. And not only is the male female dichotomy not right, that there are intersex, and there's a lot more intersexuality than we know of. Plus, there's people who are, their gender brain doesn't match their genitalia, and that is, people seem to want to punish people that are born that way, and that's, once you learn more about the science, that just does not hold up. But men and women feel the same, think the same, behave a lot the same. There's so much more overlap than there are differences. And the actual differences, there's a researcher, Janet Shibley Hyde, who did a big meta analysis of all the differences, and she found so very few things where men and women were actually different. We're actually very similar. We want love and connection and support. And the idea that women are all emotional and men aren't, no, we feel all the same things. It's just that women are reinforced to express them, and men are punished if they do, but they still feel it. They may not express it because society doesn't allow them to. So, yeah, that's a key thing that I want to make sure that people understand, is that the differences are exaggerated. And I think just in society right now, as polarization is popular, and we like to think that everyone is so different, and we're not. We all want a lot of the similar things. And if we could talk without being angry at each other and realize that we all kind of want a lot of the same things. We just have different ways of thinking about it. So that's another big one, I think. And of course, shame reduction. We've got to get rid of the shame. It's not doing anybody any favors. And through shame reduction, you can find connection and you can find community. And when you were talking about the particular model who has, or models have people who stay with them over and over, and because they want that connection, I also have a friend who is a model on a site similar. In fact, I'm not even sure what site she is on. And she has people that come to her over and over. And she said that people just want to be accepted and loved. And I think, I mean, she is one of the most brilliant people that I know. And we were talking about cameras and about if people share their stream with her. And she said, yes. And I said, so do you see their faces? And she said, no, usually it's just their genitalia. And I said, why do you think that is? And she said, I think people want to be seen. And I was like, yes, that's it. They want to be seen and accepted.
Wow. That's one of the things that is so fascinating to me about this industry and the stigma around it, is that instantly people think it's just about sex and sexuality. But I mean, the Kinsey Institute has been studying the LiveJasmin user base, and we ourselves have been seeing what's going on within the business. And it's actually, the sexuality is just on the surface. When you start peeking at what's going on beneath that, it is so much more than that. Sexuality seems to be the door into getting whatever need met, whether, like you said, it's about being seen or heard or just accepted. Most of the time, it is about some type of connection or interaction with another human being. Because as we know, you can watch free porn online. You don't have to pay at all for that. But when you're willing to pay for someone's attention, essentially, there's something that you're wanting that is beyond the sexual. I actually interviewed a member last week, and he's been a member for 14 years. And I asked him, what's kept you on the site for so long? And he said, the talking. And I said, the talking, people are going to hear that and be like, what? This is a porn site, you know? And that's what people think. It's not. But he was like, no, the sexuality got me in the door, but I stayed for the talking. Yeah.
I completely believe that. And research in psychology would back that up as well, that people need connection. And talking is, yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Fascinating. It is so fascinating. Once you really started to study it formally, was there any misconception that you found you had about human sexuality that shifted in you?
There was a lot of that. And I think that giving myself permission to study sexuality was key in helping. I grew up evangelical, and so I had a lot of that same stuff, but I wasn't researching for myself. I was researching for the students. And that's the way I gave myself permission to do all the healing that I needed to do, right? And so, yeah, I think I was given an incredible gift to be able to do the research, to do the classes, to learn about it myself. And yeah, it has been very rewarding. And I also want to say that this point that you made about sexuality just being the way to make that initial connection, I have found through Dr. Juliana Hauser's work in, there's a course that she teaches called Revealed, and it's all about agency in your life. So it's all about being able to make decisions, about feeling like you have the power to take control of your own life. And how do we get there? Sexuality. So it gets to the root of all those things that you feel, and especially as women, about, you don't have the confidence. Well, why don't you have the confidence? I don't feel like maybe I don't even recognize that I could make a decision here, and I just kind of go along with the flow, and all those things. If you start at the root of who we are, which is sexual beings, that you can get to all those places. And so, yeah, through that course, I've learned how to make my own decisions and stand in them and feel the power of them. And um, sexuality is the doorway.
It's just so fascinating to me how far removed many of us are from this primal key part of ourselves that it's almost it's almost like if you never really had a lot of water or something, it's just so prime. And then you start drinking more water and you're like, what have I been missing out on? Obviously you wouldn't make it if you hadn't had enough water, but it's so primal for who we are. And there's someone who was saying that any form of pleasure that we experience, even if it's a delicious ice cream, that is connected to our sexuality. All pleasure is under that umbrella. It doesn't have to be intercourse. And that's another, I think, misunderstanding, is that sex means intercourse. It doesn't. Our sexuality is actually quite vast.
Yeah, and that's why the research about the clitoris is so key, because it's about pleasure. And if we don't allow ourselves to have any pleasure and we think it's bad, how in God's name are we going to be able to accept an orgasm and the power that comes with that? And so, yeah, pleasure is important, and understanding our role in it, and giving ourselves permission for that. And in fact, I've been doing a little bit of work and understanding the difference between comfort and pleasure, right? So comfort, you feel bad and you want some comfort food, and so you eat a big plate of pasta with some cheese on it, and it's comfort. And then pleasure is when you eat, a chocolate hot lava cake, right? That pleasure, and you give yourself permission for that. And you can think about comfort as, going to the fair and riding the merry-go-round. Yeah, that's a lovely experience. But you get on the Screaming Eagle at Dollywood, whoo, that's pleasure. And so just giving ourselves permission to have those moments of pleasure is really important in our lives.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And I think especially, women need to work on this in general, because there's been a programming in many women to not go towards their pleasure.
Right. And they're bad people somehow if they do.
They do. That's why we judge and stigmatize and shame every woman that we sense at all has unlocked the key to her pleasure and might be helping others. In my opinion, that's what models on LiveJasmin do. I mean, these women have unlocked their own pleasure. They're helping others unlock their pleasure, and they are extremely stigmatized.
Yes. And my friend that does this work, I see her not as a sex worker. She's a therapist. I mean, she is helping people, and she will tell me some stories, of course, all anonymized, but she will tell me some things about people and what they're working through. And I'm like, man, you are doing some good work. And because these people aren't going to go to a therapist, right? But they do need to work through some things. And so a lot of what she does is help them work through it. It's amazing.
Yep. And I've also noticed that I think part of why a lot of members keep coming back and keep coming back and keep coming back for so many years is because they are getting this psychological relief, and I don't think they're realizing what's fully happening sometimes. Like, wow, my deepest inner need is being met and I'm getting psychological relief. They just know it feels so good. That's what they know, you know?
Right. Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And they may not even recognize that it's something to go see a therapist about. Or maybe they did go see a therapist and the therapist shamed them when they wanted to talk about their sexuality. And that's where models are so particularly good at this in not reflecting shame.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. What a beautiful conversation this has been.
You are wonderful. You are just so lovely and what a joy to talk to.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Before we wrap things up, I would say my final question to you is, from your perspective, what are our next steps collectively or individually on helping to create and move forward a more sexually well society?
So I'm an educator. I think the key is education, and I feel blessed to do that. I love that you're working with the Kinsey Institute, getting the research out there and then getting it to the educators so that the educators can get the information out there is key. I also think that we need some policy shifts. I would really like to see sex education much earlier. And in fact, most parents want comprehensive sex education, but it doesn't get translated into policy to have it in the public schools. I think it needs to be early and often and not shameful. So, yeah, I think we're moving in all the right directions and the research, the education, the policy. Um, we just have to keep going and keep pushing. And it's hard work. And I love that the community of sexuality is big and supportive of one another, regardless in what area that you work in. And um, I'm happy to be a part of it.
So beautifully said. Seriously, and thank you for your work because you are on the front lines and your work is really important. I know a lot of people probably got a lot out of this interview, so thank you.
Well, thank you. And thank you for your work and for doing these interviews. This is just fantastic. And to be able to have a place where you can get members, you can get models, you can get researchers, you can get educators, and all of us are in the same community and getting that out there. And you are such a great interviewer. So thank you so much for inviting me. I really appreciate it.
Thank you so much.